Winter in our area isn't gentle. It arrives early, stays late, and buries everything under layers of heavy, wet snow that has to be dealt with constantly. When I bought my property, I accepted that reality. What I didn't accept was becoming the HOA's unofficial dumping ground every time the plows came through their neighborhood. The first time it happened, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I woke up to find a long ridge of snow piled neatly along the edge of my land, right where their private street met my property line. It was inconvenient, but I assumed it was a one-time mistake. Plows move fast, drivers cut corners, things happen. I shoveled what I needed and moved on. Then it happened again. And again. By the third snowfall, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every time the HOA cleared their streets, the excess snow ended up pushed directly onto my land. Not a little bit. Tons of it. Packed, icy, impossible to move without heavy equipment. My driveway access narrowed. My drainage ditch disappeared. My grass vanished under a growing white wall that wasn't melting anytime soon. I contacted the HOA politely at first. I sent photos. I marked the property line on a map. I explained that snow dumping on private property wasn't allowed and that it was causing damage. The response was dismissive. They claimed the snow was temporary. They said winter conditions required flexibility. They suggested I was overreacting. By mid-January, my flexibility was gone. Each storm added another layer. The pile grew taller, denser, and harder. When temperatures dipped, it froze solid, forming an icy mass that loomed along the edge of their street like a slow-growing glacier. Meanwhile, the HOA's side remained clear, clean, and perfectly maintained. Their convenience came at my expense, and they knew it. I sent a formal notice next. Certified mail. Clear language. No emotion. Stop dumping snow on my property immediately. The response came from the HOA president herself, and it was short. They denied responsibility, claimed the snow naturally accumulated, suggested I install barriers if I didn't like it. That suggestion stuck with me. February arrived with record snowfall. One storm after another buried the area, and each time, the plows followed the same routine. Clear their road. Push everything onto my side. By then, the snowbank was taller than my fence and stretched the length of the street. It blocked sight lines, crushed shrubs, and created runoff issues that flooded part of my yard when temperatures briefly rose. I documented everything. Dates, photos, video, measurements. I didn't confront the plow drivers. I didn't argue with the HOA showboats. I watched. I recorded. And I waited. Neighbors started asking questions. Some apologized quietly. Others shrugged and said it was just how the HOA does things. That phrase told me everything. This wasn't an accident. It was a system. And I was the release valve. One afternoon, standing at the edge of my property, staring at the massive snow pile they'd built all winter long, something clicked. The HOA had been very clear. They weren't going to stop. They assumed I'd eventually give up, clean it myself, and accept the damage. They were wrong. If they wanted to use my land as storage, then I was going to use what they dumped there. Not emotionally, not recklessly, but deliberately, legally, and in a way they wouldn't be able to ignore. Because that snow wasn't just a problem anymore. It was material. Once the idea formed, I didn't act on it right away. That's always been my rule with conflicts like this. Anger makes noise. Patience gathers leverage. I spent the next week watching the plows, tracking their routes, and confirming what I already knew. Every snowfall followed the same pattern. They cleared their street efficiently, then angled the blade just enough to send everything straight onto my side of the property line. No hesitation. No adjustment. Just routine. I contacted the county next, not to complain, but to ask questions. Snow disposal regulations were surprisingly clear. Snow removed from private roads could not be dumped onto neighboring private property without permission. Liability for damage followed the party doing the dumping, not the landowner receiving it. I requested copies of the ordinances and saved them. Paper beats opinions every time. Armed with that information, I sent one final notice to the HOA. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't threatening. It simply stated that continued dumping would be considered unauthorized use of my property and that I would take appropriate action if it continued. I included photos, measurements, and a time-stamped video clip. They never responded. The next storm arrived 2 days later. Overnight, another 3 feet fell. By morning, the plows were out again, and I watched from my window as they did exactly what they'd always done. The blade angled. The snow surged. My property absorbed it all. The pile grew wider and taller, pressed tight against the edge of their street, like a frozen barricade waiting to be shaped. That was the moment I stopped thinking of it as damage and started thinking of it as construction material. Snow compacts. Snow freezes. Layer by layer, it becomes dense enough to stand on, then hard enough to redirect traffic if shaped properly. The HOA had unknowingly done the hardest part for me. They delivered the raw material, compacted it with plows, and reinforced it with weeks of freezing temperatures. I checked the forecast. A sustained cold stretch was coming. No thaw. No melt. Perfect conditions. Using stakes and spray paint, I marked my property line clearly found in the survey. I didn't cross it. I didn't encroach on their road. Everything I did stayed firmly on my side. Then I brought in rented equipment under the guise of snow management. Nothing illegal about managing what's on your land. I started early in the morning, shaping the pile deliberately. I wasn't building a random mound. I was forming a vertical face along my property line, compressing and packing the snow until it was solid. Each pass of the equipment reinforced it further. By midday, the structure was unmistakable. Tall, dense, continuous. From their street, it looked like a wall. Cars slowed as they approached it. Drivers hesitated. Sight lines disappeared. The HOA's clean, open street now terminated in a frozen barrier they hadn't planned for. Technically, the road was still clear. Practically, it was unusable. Plows couldn't push snow past it anymore without dumping it back onto themselves. That afternoon, my phone started ringing. The HOA president left a voicemail demanding I stop immediately. She claimed I was creating a hazard. I saved the message. Another board member emailed accusing me of retaliation. I saved that too. When they finally acknowledged the snow was theirs, it was already too late. I replied once. Briefly. I informed them I was managing snow on my property and that any concerns about snow placement should be directed to whoever had been dumping it there all winter. The silence that followed was immediate. That night, temperatures dropped even lower. The wall froze solid. And by morning, the HOA's problem was no longer my snow. It was their blocked street. By the next morning, the situation had escalated beyond angry emails and ignored voicemails. The wall was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a problem everyone could see. Cars stopped at the end of the HOA street, engines idling as drivers stared at the towering barrier of compacted snow. Some tried to turn around awkwardly. Others got out, walked closer, and took photos. Within hours, the neighborhood group chat was buzzing. I watched it all from a distance, not hiding, not gloating, just observing. The snow wall stood exactly where it was supposed to, aligned perfectly with my property line. It didn't spill onto their asphalt. It didn't cross into the roadway. It simply existed, tall and immovable, built entirely from what they had dumped on me for months. The HOA board scrambled. A notice went out claiming there was an unexpected obstruction affecting traffic flow. No mention of snow dumping. No mention of responsibility. Just urgency. They called an emergency meeting and invited the city Public Works Department, hoping someone else would fix it for them. Public Works arrived mid-morning. I know because I saw the truck slow down, then stop. The workers got out, looked at the wall, checked maps, and talked quietly among themselves. One of them walked over to my driveway and asked if I was the property owner. I said yes. Calmly. Politely. He asked if I'd built the wall. I told him I'd reshaped snow that had been dumped onto my land. I showed him the survey stakes, the property map, and the ordinance printouts. He nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "As long as it's on your property, it's not our call." That was the moment the HOA lost control of the narrative. They tried shifting tactics. Instead of accusing me, they accused the plow contractor. Instead of denying the dumping, they called it temporary placement. Instead of demanding I remove the wall, they asked if we could work together on a solution. Every message was softer than the last. But the damage was done. Residents were frustrated. School buses had to reroute. Delivery drivers refused to enter the street. Emergency access was suddenly a topic no one wanted to explain. And every single one of those problems pointed back to the same source: months of snow dumped where it didn't belong. The HOA president showed up that afternoon. Not with a clipboard, with gloves and a forced smile. She stood at the edge of the wall and asked if we could talk. I agreed, but I didn't move anything. She explained how difficult winter operations were, how plowing required tough decisions, how no one intended for this to happen. I listened. Then I asked a single question. Why didn't it stop when I asked you to? She didn't have an answer. She suggested I lower the wall just a bit so plows could push snow through. I reminded her that pushing snow through meant pushing it back onto my land. She suggested splitting the cost of removal. I reminded her that I hadn't created the snow. She suggested legal action. I reminded her of the ordinances. The conversation ended without resolution. That evening, another storm hit. Lighter this time, but enough to add pressure. The plows couldn't move snow forward anymore. The wall stopped them cold. They had nowhere to put it. For the first time all winter, the HOA had to deal with its own accumulation. I received one final email that night.
Short. Direct.
They would cease dumping snow on my property immediately and arrange for removal of the existing piles at their expense if I agreed to dismantle the wall afterward. I didn't reply right away. I stepped outside and looked at the wall, now reinforced by fresh snowfall and freezing air. It stood as proof of something simple: ignoring boundaries works until someone enforces them. And the HOA had just learned that lesson the hard way. The next 48 hours were the quietest the neighborhood had been all winter. No plows ran past my property. No fresh piles appeared along the boundary. Instead, the HOA street slowly filled with snow they could no longer shove somewhere else. Cars struggled. Residents complained. And suddenly, the inconvenience they'd outsourced to me became impossible to ignore. I didn't touch the wall. Emails continued to arrive, each one more carefully worded than the last. Where there had once been denial, there was now concern. Where there had been dismissal, there was now urgency. The HOA attorney even entered the conversation, asking for a mutually agreeable resolution. That phrase told me they finally understood something important. This wasn't about preference anymore. It was about exposure. I responded once, attaching the same documentation I'd already sent: ordinances, surveys, photographs, timestamps. I reiterated that the wall was built entirely on my property using snow deposited there by their contractor. I also stated clearly that any modification or removal would require a written agreement outlining snow management going forward, including penalties for future dumping. That slowed things down. They tried pressure next. Subtle at first. Suggestions that emergency services might be impacted. Implications that liability could somehow shift to me. I forwarded those emails to the county and asked for clarification. The reply was brief and devastating to their position. As long as I wasn't obstructing the public right-of-way, responsibility rested with the party that created the conditions leading to the obstruction. Which wasn't me. Residents started talking openly now. Not just online, but face-to-face. A few stopped by to apologize for not saying anything earlier. One admitted they'd complained about the snow piles for years, but assumed nothing could be done. Another thanked me outright. That surprised me more than anything. I hadn't done this to make a statement. I'd done it to stop damage. But sometimes those two things overlap. The HOA scheduled another emergency meeting. This time, it wasn't about unexpected obstructions. It was about snow removal contracts, liability, and cost overruns. Their plow contractor refused to continue service unless the dumping issue was resolved. They didn't want the risk. Insurance questions were raised. Budgets were recalculated. All because of a wall made from their own snow. 3 days later, heavy equipment arrived, not to touch my property, but to begin removing the accumulated snow from their side of the street and hauling it off-site. I watched from a distance as truck after truck carried away what had been my problem for months. It was oddly satisfying, not because they were suffering, but because the imbalance had finally corrected itself. That afternoon, I received the agreement. It was formal, signed, and specific. No snow from HOA-maintained roads would be deposited onto my property. Any future violation would result in immediate fines and liability for damages. They would remove the remaining snow from my land at their expense once temperatures allowed safe dismantling. In return, I would remove the wall. I signed. When the equipment returned to my side days later, I supervised quietly. The wall came down piece by piece, hauled away the same way it should have been handled from the beginning. Beneath it, my land was damaged but intact. Reparable. Manageable. No longer ignored. As the last truck pulled away, the boundary looked normal again.
Clean. Clear.
Uneventful. Which was exactly how it should have been all winter. The HOA never apologized. I didn't expect them to. What mattered was that the dumping stopped, the damage was acknowledged, and the rules suddenly mattered again. Authority had been replaced with accountability. And for the first time since the snow started falling, I could look at my property line without feeling frustrated. Winter wasn't over yet, but the problem was. Spring arrived slowly that year, like it was checking first to see if winter had truly given up. Patches of snow lingered in shaded corners, shrinking day by day, while the ground beneath softened and revealed the marks left behind.
Tire ruts.
Compacted soil. Bent grass. Evidence of months where my property had been treated as overflow space instead of someone's land. But it was quiet now. No plows. No dumping. No emails marked urgent. Just the steady hum of normal life returning. I spent time repairing the damage, reseeding where I could, leveling areas that had been crushed under tons of snow. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it felt good knowing it wouldn't be undone by the next storm. The HOA kept its distance. Official notices stopped coming. Board members no longer walked the boundary pretending not to look. The new snow management plan was posted publicly, detailed and strict. Contractors followed it carefully. Once bitten, twice cautious. Neighbors changed too. A few waved now, when they hadn't before. Some stopped to chat, curious but respectful. One admitted the situation had forced the HOA to rethink more than just snow dumping. Budgets were being reviewed. Contracts renegotiated. Oversight tightened. Apparently, my wall had done more than block a street. It had exposed cracks in how things were run. I didn't take credit for that. I didn't need to. What stayed with me wasn't the conflict or the standoff. It was how easily boundaries get ignored when people assume compliance. How quickly inconvenience becomes acceptable when it belongs to someone else. And how surprised everyone acts when that pattern finally stops. I never wanted to fight in HOA. I never wanted to build a wall. I just wanted my property respected the same way theirs was. The difference was that I was willing to enforce that respect when asking politely failed. Looking back, the wall wasn't an act of retaliation. It was a mirror. Everything they'd pushed onto me simply came back into view, impossible to ignore. And once it was visible, it had to be dealt with. That's how accountability works. By the time the last traces of snow melted, the property line looked ordinary again. No barrier. No equipment. Just grass waiting to grow back. If you drove by, you'd never guess what had happened there a few months earlier. But I remembered. And so did the HOA. Sometimes people ask if I'd do it again. If I'd build the wall knowing how messy things became. I always give the same answer. I wouldn't need to. Because once boundaries are enforced, they tend to hold. Winter came back the following year, as it always does. Snow fell. Plows ran. And every single load went exactly where it was supposed to go. Not an inch crossed onto my land. Not once. That was the real victory. Not the inconvenience. Not the attention. Not the temporary power shift. Just the quiet return of fairness. The simple acknowledgement that ownership means something and that easier isn't the same as right. I never heard another complaint about snow after that. And I never had to send another email quoting ordinances. All it took was one season, one wall, and the willingness to say no when no one expected it. Sometimes, the strongest statement isn't made with words. It's made with boundaries. And once they're in place, everything else finally falls into line.